Russell has already testified twice before special counsel grand juries. Once, reportedly, for Smith's investigation into Trump's use of election fraud claims to fundraise after the 2020 election. And then another time as part of the Mar-a-Lago documents investigation. William Russell really seems to know a lot about almost everything. So what was he doing with the grand jury today, and what can that tell us about where this whole investigation stands? Joining us now are Danya Perry, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Andrew Weissman, you may have heard of him, the former lead prosecutor for special counsel Robert Mueller and co-host of the must-listen-to MSNBC podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump. Andrew, Danya, it's great to see you both in the flesh as this, well, I guess the prognostication continues about what's happening here. Andrew, let me start with you in terms of the presence of Will Russell testifying today. What does this tell you about where we are in the January 6th investigation?
Well, first, there's nothing unusual about somebody being called back into the grand jury. That can happen for a whole variety of reasons. It could happen because Jack Smith wants to actually see how he testifies and sort of get a sense of his credibility. It could be also they just learned something new that they want to ask him about. It also could be that they have some questions about things he might have said earlier that they are concerned about whether it's totally accurate. That might be a bit of a euphemism, and whether he now has his memory refreshed. It could be any of those things. It does suggest it's sort of a later stage. I mean, obviously, if you get a target letter, that's the key thing that tells you it's at this point where I think very much at the end stage. But to your point, he is the sort of natural person to make sure you've sort of gone through everything he knows, because he is there with the former president day in and day out. So in some ways, it's even better than Mark Meadows. Plus, he's sort of a more junior person. So you might, I stress, get a more candid version of what happened.
Well, right. I mean, it's like prosecuting a mob case. You start with the lower level people who don't have as much skin invested in the game that were in the room where it happened. Does it surprise you, Danya, that this is the first time we've really talked about William Russell? This is someone who was not apparently on the radar of the January 6th committee, but then you see the photos of him on January 6th, and he is in the place you need to be to find out Trump's state of mind in a critical moment in American history.
Yeah, to Andrew's point, it often is the kind of fly on the wall who makes the best witness for the prosecution. They know so much, they hear everything, but sometimes the higher-ups don't really notice their presence and are very candid while they're there. And they also don't usually have the same kind of culpability or exposure. And so they don't have to make deals, so they're not a complicated witness in that sense. So just like Cassidy Hutchinson in some way was a wonderful witness for the January 6th committee, and she put so much into the record that we hadn't known, this is kind of the analog in some way. And so it's not surprising that he'd be called time and time again. Perhaps, if we don't know, and I'm kind of answering a little bit or adding on to the question you put to Andrew, but it doesn't necessarily mean that much. It can be many reasons, as you said. It can be tricks of the calendar. It doesn't mean that they are or not indicting next week. Or they can continue to put people in the grand jury, as we've seen with the Mar-a-Lago investigation.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, to everybody's point, this is someone who has been testifying about multiple investigations here, Andrew. And I wonder, there's an anecdote, there's a story about what happened in court today. A judge in an unrelated case effectively forced William Russell's lawyer to give up a little bit of information about why William Russell was meeting with the grand jury today. Can you offer a little insight into that?
Sure. So essentially, Trevor McFadden was the judge, and the defense counsel for Mr. Russell was supposed to be present before Trevor McFadden for a sentencing of a different defendant who he also represented. And by the way, the same defense lawyer also represents Mr.